carry on where the Lord Oxford left off, if I may, and look at the political risks of energy. I want to talk about terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and finally, what I see as the greatest risk overhanging the global economy, and that is, of course, the fate of the U.S. dollar and our massive current account deficit in the United States. Let's take a look at energy, and here's the key picture of energy, which is to say the Persian Gulf from a satellite photograph. And the reason there is a picture of the Persian Gulf, of course, is because that is where the oil is. And as non-OPEC oil diminishes, as it is beginning to do, and as our dependence on the Persian Gulf grows for our need for oil, we become ever more dependent upon politically unstable, politically unreliable, and fundamentally hostile states for our own supplies of energy. Now, one of these guys is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. You have to figure it out. So here we have George Bush and Crown Prince Abdullah, whom, as you all know, is running the kingdom on a day-to-day basis because his brother, King Fahd, has had a stroke more than 10 years ago and cannot function. And so here are the other two key figures in the kingdom, the Minister of Defense, chatting with the American Minister of Defense, Prince Sultan, and on the right side of the picture we have King Fahd, who looks great, but can't function mentally. Now, what is important about the picture of these three gentlemen, actually what's important about it is they all have black hair. I figured that one out, since what's really important is that they're all in their mid-80s. And so the point of my tale is that all three of these leaders who are maintaining the stability of the kingdom and its willingness to supply more oil than anyone else is going to end shortly, because all three of these people are going to die in the very near term. And if you look at how the kingdom has organized its succession planning since the death of Abdulaziz, the founder of the kingdom, which occurred back in 1953, you see that they have reached the end of the succession formula, which they identified way back there more than 50 years ago. Crown Prince Abdullah on the far right is the last of the agreed-upon successors to the deceased king back in 1953, and now there is no further agreement on the succession. So Saudi Arabia faces a second problem, which is not only that the three rulers are in their mid-80s and ill. By the way, Prince Sultan was recently operated on for cancer. But in addition to that, there is no agreement on where the succession should go in Saudi Arabia. So here we have a situation in which the world's most important energy supplier is on the verge of considerable political instability. And if you take a look at this, you realize, this is an ExxonMobil chart, you realize that we're going to need these people in the Gulf more than ever, because even ExxonMobil now agrees that by 2010 there will be a decrease in the amount of oil supplied by non-OPEC members. And so therefore our dependence on the OPEC cartel is going to increase. And furthermore, and again, very much like what you saw from Lord Oxford, the key thing about the increase in the demand for energy is not whether it's going up 1.5% a year or under conditions of extraordinarily robust growth in China and the U.S. as much as 2% a year, because even 2% on 80 million barrels a day is a staggering amount of oil. The key thing is that black band that goes underneath, which indicates that the average oil field declines every year by something like 5.4%, and therefore, to maintain production, you've got to increase the output by 5.4%, and then add the 2% increase. Well, you're talking about 80 million barrels of oil a day, and you're trying to generate an additional 6.5%, say, or more. Now you're talking about compounding 6.5% on 80 million. You're talking about the demand for a fabulous amount of new oil, which is an extremely difficult thing to continue to produce. This is especially true when U.S. domestic supply is going down, and therefore U.S. imports are going up. And despite the best efforts of the President of the United States, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR as they call it in the United States, is not a solution to American energy problems. There's not enough oil there. It's going to take forever to get that oil down to the lower 48. And the black line on this chart is going to continue to go up as America becomes more demanding of foreign petroleum. The other big demand, of course, is China, and China's demand has outstripped its local supply as well. Reality is that the world's second largest importer of oil after the United States is in fact not China, which you constantly read in the paper. The second largest importer of oil after the United States is the European Union. And the reason the European Union has gotten off the hook is that until now, everybody looks at the European Union as a set of individual countries. So, of course, if you compare Germany's imported oil with America's or with China's, Germany's imported oil is quite small. But if you add up the 15 member states of the EU, now the 25 member states, you get the European Union importing almost as much oil as the United States. And so we can't drop the significance of European imports of oil out of this picture, as most people do when they talk about both U.S. and China. In fact, the EU is a tremendously important factor in the global price-supply situation. So partly for that reason, of course, we see these extraordinary prices. You know these numbers. You know how much less oil is in real terms than it was back in 1980. And certainly the Arab oil-producing states know how much less the price of oil is now than it was back in the 1980s, because none of them are feeling particularly rich. Final point. Russia as a supplier of natural gas. A vast number of European countries, as you all know, get massive amounts of natural gas from Russia. Even though France gets something like 24% of its natural gas from Russia, obviously 24% of France's natural gas is a hell of a lot more than 100% of Latvia's. So the supply is staggering. And more importantly than this existing supply of natural gas, we are going to find, is that Russia will become a major supplier of natural gas to the United States. And whether it be from the far northern port of Murmansk in the far northwest of the country, or whether it be more out of the cross-Pacific Sakhalin Island gas fields, there's going to be major transport of LNG from Russia to the U.S., to North America, and there's virtually no American city which wants an LNG terminal built in its harbor. And the solution to that problem is the Canadians are already building LNG terminals, and Russian natural gas will go into LNG terminals in Canada, from which it will be piped down into the United States, because in many cases those pipelines, by the way, already exist. My point of that is, if you think about Bush's unusual policy towards his dear friend Vlad, as he said at a news conference recently, Vlad the Impaler, you remember that guy. As he said to his dear friend Vlad, he said, pretty much all of the problems which Russia is causing the world, and they are many, from failure to secure their nuclear weapons, to exterminating the Chechen people, and interfering in the former Soviet republics, and a long list. President of the United States seems willing to overlook all of those, and the reason primarily is because of the significance of Russia as a supplier of natural gas, not so much to Europe, but increasingly in the future to the United States. And so the Middle East is not going to go away. That's the good news for me. I picked a field that never sort of got boring. I didn't know that was going to be the case.